On August 13, 1944, General George Patton stood in his headquarters studying a map that promised the total destruction of the German military in France. His armored spearheads had just captured Argentan and stood only 15 miles from sealing a massive trap around 100,000 enemy soldiers. One more push would end the war, but then the phone rang with a command that would haunt the world for decades. General Omar Bradley's voice crackled over the line with an order that defied every military instinct Patton possessed, commanding him to stop immediately and forbidding any advance beyond Argentan, even though victory lay within a single afternoon's drive. This single moment of hesitation did not just allow a broken enemy to breathe, but fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Second World War, transforming a potential August victory into a winter of slaughter that would eventually claim the lives of thousands of Americans in the freezing snow of the Ardennes. To understand why the Allied command chose political caution over tactical annihilation, we must look back at the bloody weeks preceding this crisis, when the invasion of Europe seemed to be dying in the thick hedgerows of Normandy. For 6 grueling weeks after the D-Day landings, the Allied armies had found themselves strangled by the infamous Bulge country, a labyrinth of ancient earthen banks and dense vegetation that turned every field into a natural fortress for the German defenders. British and Canadian forces under General Bernard Montgomery fought a series of brutal, high-attrition battles around the strategic city of Caen, while American forces under Bradley ground through the hedgerows meter by painful meter against an enemy that held every position until it was completely untenable. The static nature of the front was a nightmare for the Allied High Command, who feared a repeat of the trench warfare of the Great War. Yet the German 7th Army was slowly bleeding to death, even as they held their lines with fanatical determination. The deadlock finally shattered on July 25, 1944, when the Allied High Command launched Operation Cobra, a massive offensive designed to punch through the thrust of the German defenses at Saint-Lô. Bradley's First Army, spearheaded by the aggressive leadership of General Lightning Joe Collins and his 7th Corps, utilized a devastating carpet bombing campaign to pulverize the German positions and create a narrow corridor of chaos. Through this jagged hole poured the newly activated Third Army under George Patton, who had been waiting in the wings for his moment to unleash a war of movement that would stun both his allies and his enemies. As Patton's tanks began racing south and east across the open plains of France, covering over 200 miles in just 2 weeks, the German High Command faced a total collapse of their Western Front. At this critical juncture, Adolf Hitler made the most catastrophic decision of the entire campaign by ignoring the advice of his generals to withdraw to the Seine River and instead ordering a desperate counterattack. On August 7, 1944, 4 elite panzer divisions struck west toward Mortain in an attempt to cut off the American breakout at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. This offensive, fueled more by Hitler's delusions than by actual military capability, failed completely within 48 hours as Allied air power and stubborn American infantry defensive lines shredded the attacking columns. The failure at Mortain created an unprecedented opportunity for the Allies because the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were now extended far to the west, caught in a deep salient with Allied armies pressing in from 3 sides. To the north, British and Canadian forces intensified their pressure toward the town of Falaise, while Patton's Third Army wheeled around the southern flank to strike from the rear. By August 12th, over 100,000 German troops were trapped in a rapidly shrinking area, with their only hope of survival being a narrow corridor of escape to the east toward the safety of the Seine. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge recognized the impending doom and begged for permission to withdraw, knowing that his armies faced complete annihilation if the pocket was sealed. However, Hitler remained obstinate, demanding that the troops hold their positions even as the Allied noose tightened with every passing hour. Patton saw the tactical situation with crystalline clarity and realized that the classic encirclement maneuver every military strategist dreamed of was within his grasp. Major General Wade Hyslop's 15th Corps had reached Argentan on August 13th with minimal resistance, and reconnaissance units reported that the final 15 miles to Falaise were lightly defended and ripe for the taking. The 2nd French Armored Division and the 5th Armored Division were fueled and ready to strike north to link up with Montgomery's forces, a move that would have effectively ended the war in the West by destroying the core of the German army in France. But as Patton prepared to give the order for the final assault, he was confronted by the rigid boundary lines drawn by Allied planners to prevent friendly fire between American and British sectors. Patton, who prioritized the destruction of the enemy over the adherence to bureaucratic maps, was prepared to ignore these constraints and risk a confrontation with Montgomery's forces to achieve a decisive victory. He reached out to Bradley to request permission to cross the boundary and close the gap, but Bradley was a man of a different temperament, a staff officer at heart who valued coordination and caution above all else. Bradley feared that if Patton's armor pushed north while Montgomery's Canadians pushed south, the resulting confusion would lead to a friendly fire disaster of epic proportions. There were legitimate concerns that American and British tank crews, using different radio frequencies and recognition signals, would mistake each other for the enemy in the smoke and chaos of the battlefield. Yet beyond the tactical risks, a more delicate political reality weighed heavily on Bradley's shoulders. As Montgomery was technically his equal in the command structure, and the boundary agreements had been personally negotiated by Eisenhower himself, the relationship between the American and British commanders was already strained by months of friction regarding resource allocation and strategic vision, with Montgomery resenting the growing American dominance of the campaign. Bradley knew that if he allowed Patton to trespass into Montgomery's sector without prior consent, it would be viewed as a deliberate insult that could trigger a diplomatic crisis between Churchill and Roosevelt. Faced with the choice between a messy tactical victory and the preservation of alliance harmony, Bradley chose the politically safe route and issued the order that left Patton speechless with rage. Patton's response was characteristically blunt, as he told Bradley on the phone to let him go to Falaise so he could drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk, a comment that revealed his utter contempt for what he perceived as Montgomery's sluggish pace. Despite Patton's furious arguments that the road was open and every hour of delay was a gift to the Germans, Bradley refused to budge, repeating the order to hold at Argentan and wait for the British to close the gap from the north. Patton hung up the phone with barely contained fury and relayed the halt order to his corps commanders, forcing thousands of American tanks to sit idling along the road south of Falaise. The tankers, who could hear the distant roar of artillery and see the smoke rising from the German positions just over the horizon, were bewildered by the order to stop when the enemy was clearly in full retreat. Patton paced his headquarters in frustration, telling his staff that they were about to make the most terrible mistake of the entire war simply because they were afraid of hurting Montgomery's feelings. He recorded in his diary that night his certainty that Montgomery would not reach the gap in time, and his prediction would soon prove to be a dark omen for the months of fighting that lay ahead. As the American engines were shut down and the crews climbed out onto their hulls to wait, the narrow 15-mile corridor remained wide open, and the first of many thousands of German soldiers began their desperate flight to the east. While the American Third Army sat in forced idleness at Argentan, the responsibility for closing the trap shifted entirely to the shoulders of General Montgomery's 21st Army Group, which was laboring to push south through a landscape of nightmare and fire. The advance was spearheaded by the 1st Canadian Army under Lieutenant General Henry Crerar, supported by the British 1st Corps, both of which were veteran formations that had been bled white by weeks of constant combat since the landings in June. Unlike the open plains that had allowed Patton's armor to race across the French countryside, the terrain north of Falaise was a claustrophobic maze of bocage and fortified villages where German defenders contested every meter of ground with a suicidal intensity. The elite SS Panzer divisions holding the northern shoulder of the pocket knew that if they broke, the entire 7th Army would be lost, and they conducted a series of savage fighting withdrawals that utilized every earthen bank and stone farmhouse as a pillbox. Montgomery, true to his doctrine of methodical warfare, refused to be hurried by the mounting crisis and insisted on massive artillery preparations before every assault to keep his own casualties as low as possible. This deliberate pace meant that progress was measured in mere hundreds of meters per day, and by August 16, 3 full days after Patton had been ordered to halt, Canadian forces had still not managed to secure the ruins of Falaise. The town finally fell on August 17th, but even then, the tactical victory was hollow because the gap had merely shifted further east toward the village of Chembois rather than closing completely. Between August 13th and August 21st, the narrow corridor remained a hemorrhaging wound in the Allied lines, through which tens of thousands of German soldiers poured in a desperate bid for survival. What the Allied commanders failed to realize in their pursuit of perfect coordination was that they were witnessing a rout of biblical proportions, where the German army was dissolving into a chaotic mass of men and horses, fleeing toward the Seine River. The carnage inside this corridor of death was so extreme that Allied pilots flying thousands of feet above the battlefield reported they could smell the stench of rotting flesh and burning rubber rising through the cockpits of their planes. The roads were so choked with the wreckage of shattered Tiger tanks, splintered horse-drawn wagons, and the bloated carcasses of thousands of draft animals that the retreating Germans often had to steer their vehicles over the bodies of their own fallen comrades just to move forward. Many German soldiers eventually reached such a state of terror from the constant strafing of Allied fighter bombers that they abandoned perfectly functional equipment to flee on foot through the woods, preferring the uncertainty of the forest to the certain death found on the open roads. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had replaced the disgraced von Kluge, realized that his only mission was to save as many experienced combat veterans as possible to fight another day, and he organized frantic rearguard actions to keep the door open just a few hours longer. By the time Polish and American forces finally linked up at Chambois and Saint-Lambert on August 19th and 21st respectively, the trap was finally sealed, but the prize inside had largely evaporated. While the Allies captured approximately 50,000 prisoners and counted 10,000 German dead, they had allowed the most dangerous element of the enemy force to slip through their fingers. Historians estimate that between 20,000 and 50,000 German soldiers escaped the encirclement, and crucially, these were not disorganized stragglers, but the elite core of the Waffen-SS and veteran Wehrmacht divisions. Survivors from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend all made it across the Seine with their command structures intact. These men were the professional NCOs, experienced tank commanders, and battle-hardened officers who understood the nuances of combined arms warfare and possessed the psychological resilience to rebuild shattered units from the ground up. Field Marshal Model immediately took these survivors and used them as the iron skeleton for the new defensive lines being established along the Siegfried Line in the German border. If the Falaise pocket had been closed on August 13th, these men would have spent the rest of the war in prisoner of war camps, and the German army would have lacked the human capital necessary to stage a meaningful defense of the fatherland. Instead, the Allied failure to coordinate effectively in the heat of the moment granted the Third Reich a second lease on life, transforming what should have been a final pursuit into a grueling war of attrition that would last through the following spring. The immediate consequence of this strategic blunder became apparent during the bloody autumn of 1944 as the Allied advance stalled against the very veterans who had escaped the Normandy trap. American forces attempting to punch through the west wall at Aachen and in the dark, rain-soaked ridges of the Hürtgen forests found themselves facing an enemy that was far more capable and determined than the raw recruits they had expected to encounter. The German defenders knew American tactics intimately because they had spent the entire summer fighting them in the hedgerows, and they used this knowledge to inflict staggering casualties on Allied units that were already overextended and exhausted. In the Hürtgen forest alone, over 33,000 American soldiers became casualties in a battle for strategically questionable objectives against an enemy that simply refused to break. Many of the German officers who organized these lethal defensive traps were the same men who had successfully navigated the corridor of death at Falaise, having learned that survival depended on discipline and the ruthless application of firepower. Patton, watching the casualty reports mount in his headquarters, grew increasingly bitter as he realized that the blood of his men was the price being paid for the political compromises made back in August. He argued until his dying day that the failure to seal the gap had extended the war by at least 6 months, preventing the Allies from reaching the Rhine before the onset of the brutal European winter. The optimism of late summer, when commanders spoke of the war being over by Christmas, vanished into the freezing mud of the Siegfried Line as the German army miraculously regenerated its strength. This regeneration culminated on December 16, 1944, in the Ardennes forest, when the world was stunned by the launch of the last major German offensive on the Western Front. Spearheading this final roll of the dice were the same elite SS Panzer divisions that Patton had begged to destroy 4 months earlier. The 1st SS Panzer Division led the charge in the northern sector, while the 12th SS and the 2nd SS followed in support, their ranks filled with new equipment, but led by the same veteran who had escaped through the narrow 15-mile gap at Argentan. During the Battle of the Bulge, these formations fell upon weakly defended American positions with a savagery that resulted in the bloodiest battle the United States Army ever fought in the European theater. Total American casualties exceeded 80,000 men, including 19,000 killed in action, many of whom were slaughtered by German tank crews and infantrymen who should have been out of the war by August. The connection between the decision at Argentan and the carnage in the Ardennes was direct, undeniable, and written in the blood of American teenagers freezing in foxholes at Bastogne. Patton was eventually called north to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne Division, and as he fought through the German lines, he noted with grim satisfaction that he was encountering the exact same units he had predicted would return to haunt them. He recorded in his diary that he had warned the high command that they were making a terrible mistake, and now they were paying for it in American lives in the Ardennes snow. There was no joy in being right for Patton, only a deep, abiding anger at the waste of human potential and the frustration of being held back by commanders who prioritize alliance politics over military reality. Bradley would later admit in his 1951 memoirs that the Halt order was likely his greatest mistake of the war, conceding that a more aggressive move might have shortened the conflict and saved thousands of lives. He attempted to justify the decision by citing the genuine risks of friendly fire, pointing out that coordinating two massive armies converging from opposite directions was a technical nightmare with the communication technology of 1944. However, this excuse rang hollow when compared to the Soviet Red Army, which regularly executed massive encirclements involving millions of men without the catastrophic friendly fire incidents Bradley claimed to fear. When American and Polish troops finally did link up at Chambord on August 19th, they did so successfully and without disaster, proving that proper radio discipline and coordination could have managed the risks. The uncomfortable truth that Bradley never fully admitted in print was that he had prioritized his relationship with Montgomery and the stability of the Anglo-American alliance over the tactical destruction of the enemy. In the end, the failure at the Falaise Gap stands as one of the great what-ifs of modern military history, a moment where the caution of the high command directly contradicted the aggression required for decisive victory. Every military cemetery in Europe contains the graves of men who died in the autumn of 1944 and the winter of 1945 because of a decision made on a telephone line in August. The lessons of Falaise remain relevant to this day, serving as a stark reminder that in coalition warfare, the cost of political harmony is often measured in the lives of the soldiers on the ground. Had Patton been allowed to advance those final 15 miles, the Rhine might have been crossed by October, the Nazi regime might have collapsed by Christmas, and tens of thousands of families might never have received those dreaded telegrams from the War Department. But history is not written in what-ifs. It is written in the hard, cold reality of decisions made under pressure and the long, bloody consequences that follow. Patton understood this better than anyone, and as he looked out over the graves of his men after the war, he knew that the gap that stayed open at Argentan was a wound that would never truly heal in the hearts of those who survived. The 50,000 Germans who escaped to fight at the Bulge were not just a failure of logistics or radio signals. They were a failure of nerve at the highest level of command. If you were in General Bradley's position, would you have prioritized the safety of the alliance and avoided friendly fire? Or would you have unleashed Patton to end the war regardless of the political cost? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.